The candle gutters low against damp stone walls. Beyond the iron-barred door, a gendarme shifts his weight, his boots scraping on flagstone. The air carries the smell of tallow, of mildew, of unwashed wool and ink not yet dry. A woman sits hunched over a small folding table. Her hand trembles as she writes by failing light. Outside, somewhere in the sleeping city, carpenters are already raising a wooden frame in the public square. She does not yet know the exact hour. She knows only that the hour is coming. The pen scratches across the page. Slow and deliberate, she is writing to her sister. The letter she composes in this final darkness will never reach the woman she addresses. It will be intercepted, hidden, and lost for more than 2 decades. By then, the woman who wrote it will have been dead for so long that her bones will have been mistaken for those of strangers. This is not a story about a queen who lost her crown. This is the story of how a revolution chose to break a woman in pieces before it ended her life. What the history books often compress into a single morning of October 1793 was, in reality, a meticulously engineered humiliation. It unfolded over weeks of calculated degradation, in a stone cell before a tribunal, and on a slow open cart through hostile streets. The guillotine was the final mercy. Everything before it was the punishment. Before we descend into the dampness of the Conciergerie and walk the final cobblestones of an autumn morning in 1793, drop a comment with your city and country. We want to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Hit subscribe and join Velours Spectre, where we trace the dark architecture of power and the quiet ruin of the people who once held it. You are watching Velours Spectre. By the autumn of 1793, the French Revolution had become a machine for consuming its own enemies. The Revolutionary Tribunal established that march no longer required convincing evidence. It required only suspicion. The Committee of Public Safety, led by men like Robespierre and Saint-Just, ruled by decree. The Reign of Terror was not yet officially named, but it was already underway. Power in revolutionary Paris flowed through the printed word and the public square. Newspapers like Jacques Hébert's Père Duchesne's shaped opinion through theatrical obscenity. Each issue accused, demanded, condemned. The historian Simon Schama has argued, in his Chronicle of the Revolution, that the new regime understood itself as theater, and that its violence was always partly a performance staged for a watching crowd. In this performance, no figure was more useful than the foreign queen. She had been in custody for over a year. Her husband, the king, had been beheaded in January. Their 2 children remained inside the temple tower under separate guard. The widow had been moved in early August from the tower to a far older prison, the Conciergerie on the Ile de la Cité, in the heart of Paris. The Conciergerie was no ordinary jail. It was known among Parisians as the antechamber of the guillotine. Prisoners passed through its gates and rarely returned. Built into the medieval walls of the old royal palace, it held more than 300 prisoners by the autumn of 1793, packed into stone galleries and underground halls. The cell prepared for the former queen was small. Damp seeped from its walls. A folding screen separated her from a gendarme who watched her at all hours. She was 37 years old. She had been a queen of France for 19 years. Now she was a number on a registry. Her official name in the prison records was Marie Antoinette Capet, widow of Louis Capet. The Bourbon name, by revolutionary decree, no longer existed. By the time she was led into the Conciergerie, Marie Antoinette had already been transformed. The woman who entered cell number 5 in August 1793 bore little resemblance to the Queen of Versailles. Her hair, once powdered and dressed into towering creations, had turned white. The historian Antonia Fraser, in her exhaustive biography of the Queen, documents the rapid physical decline of the prisoner during her months at the Temple and the Conciergerie. She suffered from chronic uterine bleeding, almost certainly the symptom of an underlying condition that was never properly treated. Her teeth had loosened. Her vision had weakened. She was thin to the point of frailty. The young woman assigned to assist her in the Conciergerie was named Rosalie Lamorlière. Decades later, Rosalie would write a memoir describing what she saw. She remembered the prisoner asking her with quiet politeness for clean linen. She remembered the prisoner kneeling each evening to pray. She remembered her refusing to complain even as her body failed and her clothes wore thin. This was not the foreign sovereign of revolutionary caricature. This was a 37-year-old widow watching her own erasure. She still had 2 living children somewhere in the city. She did not know where they were kept. She had been forbidden contact. She did not know that she would never see either of them again. The men who would soon try her had already decided the outcome. The trial that opened on the 14th of October was not built to determine her guilt. It was built to perform her destruction. The trigger that sealed her fate came not from the tribunal but from a flower. In late August of 1793, a former officer of the King's Guard, the Chevalier Alexandre de Rougeville, approached the Conciergerie under a false identity. He had arranged the cooperation of one of the gendarmes assigned to watch the Queen, a man named Meconis. He was permitted, briefly, into her cell. The historian Evelyne Lever, in her detailed reconstruction of the Queen's final imprisonment, describes the moment carefully. Rougeville carried with him 2 carnations. As he passed near her, he let one fall. Hidden inside the petals was a small piece of paper. The note proposed an escape plan. Marie Antoinette read it. She tried to reply by pricking letters with a pin into another piece of paper. The reply was passed back through the same gendarme. The plan was complicated, ill-conceived, and almost immediately discovered. The fallout was swift. Meconis was arrested. The investigation that followed convinced the revolutionary government that the Queen remained a dangerous symbol around which counter-revolution might rally. She had to be tried. She had to be executed. And she had to be punished, in the meantime with maximum security. She was moved from her original cell into a smaller, more isolated one. A folding screen was installed. A gendarme was now required to watch her at every hour, including when she changed her linen. The historian Antonia Fraser notes that this surveillance was experienced by the prisoner as a form of continuous violation. There was no longer any moment of privacy left to her. The Carnation affair, as it came to be known, was a failed rescue, but for the woman in the cell, it was the moment after which retreat became impossible. Whatever protection the slowness of revolutionary justice had previously offered her was now withdrawn. The tribunal would be assembled within weeks. The trial of Marie Antoinette opened on the morning of October 14, 1793, before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The chief accuser was Antoine Quentin Fouquier Tinville. The judge was Marshal Herman. The accused was permitted no time to prepare a defense. Her lawyers, 2 men named Chalvaux Lagarde and Tronson du Coudray, were assigned to her case the night before. The charges were drawn from a long indictment. She was accused of conspiring with foreign powers, of squandering state funds, of plotting against the Republic. These were the standard accusations against the former monarchy. They would have been sufficient to secure her death. Then Jacques Hébert took the stand. Hébert was the editor of Père Duchesne, the most extreme of the revolutionary newspapers. He had spent years building his career on the pornographic vilification of the Queen. Now in open court, he produced a new accusation. He claimed that the Queen had committed unspeakable intimate acts against her own son, the 8-year-old former Dauphin. The accusation was based on a coerced statement extracted from the boy by his guardians inside the temple. It was monstrous. It was almost certainly fabricated, and it was spoken aloud in court to a crowd that included women. For most of the trial, the Queen had answered the charges with composed brevity. Now she did not answer the specific charge at first. She turned, instead, toward the women in the audience. The historical record of the tribunal, preserved in the published transcripts, captures her response. She appealed, in essence, to all mothers present, asking whether such an accusation could even be answered by a mother. The room fell silent. Several women in the gallery were reported to have wept. Even the prosecution sensed it had overreached. Robespierre himself, hearing of Hébert's testimony later that day, was said to have cursed the editor for damaging the case. But the verdict was already written. On the morning of October 16th, just before 4 in the morning, the tribunal returned its judgment. Death. Within 24 hours. She was returned to her cell in the early hours of October 16. The candle was lit. She was given paper, pen, and ink. She had perhaps 6 hours left. She used them to write. The letter she composed at 4:30 that morning was addressed to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, the youngest sister of Louis XVI. It is one of the most extraordinary documents to survive the French Revolution. The historian Monroe Price, who has written extensively on the fall of the Bourbons, describes it as the testament of a woman who had nothing left to gain by dishonesty. In the letter, Marie Antoinette wrote of her children. She wrote of her faith. She asked her sister to forgive those who had testified against her, including her own son, who had been a child manipulated by his guardians. She asked that the children be raised in the religion of their father, and that they not seek to avenge her death. She wrote that she died in the Catholic faith of her ancestors. She asked forgiveness from God for any failings of her life. The letter was finished. It was sealed. It was given to one of her guards. It was never delivered. Fouquier Tinville intercepted it. He kept it among his papers. After his own execution the following year, the letter passed through several hands. It would not be made public until 1816, 23 years after her death, when the restored Bourbon monarchy recovered it from a private collection. By dawn on the 16th, the executioner had arrived. His name was Charles Henri Sanson. He was a fourth-generation hangman. He had also performed the execution of her husband 9 months earlier. By the standards of his trade, he was a careful and methodical man. The procedure was prescribed. Her hair, already short and gray, was cut close to the back of her neck, so that the blade would have a clear path. The cutting was done with a pair of scissors. The strands fell to the stone floor. She did not speak. Her hands were bound behind her back. This was a detail that distinguished her execution from that of the king. Louis XVI had walked to the scaffold with his hands free, accompanied by a priest. Marie Antoinette was permitted neither concession. The historian Caroline Weber, who has studied the symbolism of dress and ritual in the Queen's life, has noted that this binding was a deliberate humiliation, designed to mark her as a common criminal, rather than a fallen sovereign. She was dressed in a simple white chemise and given a black ribbon. A linen cap covered her shorn head. At 11 in the morning, she was led from her cell into the courtyard of the Conciergerie. There, instead of the closed carriage that had carried Louis XVI to his death, a tumbril waited. A tumbril was an open wooden cart, the kind used for transporting refuse. It had no seat. The condemned stood, or sat on a rough plank, exposed to the crowd. The route from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution covered roughly 2 kilometers. It would take more than an hour. The streets were packed with spectators. National Guardsmen lined the way. Drums beat continuously to drown out any speech the prisoner might attempt. She sat upright on the plank, her hands tied behind her, her back straight. The painter Jacques-Louis David, watching from a window along the route, made a quick sketch of her in profile. The drawing survives. It shows a thin, exhausted woman with a hard, composed face, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on something beyond the crowd. The cart moved slowly. The drum beat did not stop. Crowds along the Rue Saint-Honoré pressed against the line of soldiers. Some shouted insults. Some threw refuse. Others stood in silence, their heads uncovered, watching a woman they had once been told was a monster pass before them as a shrunken figure in white linen. The procession passed in front of the Église Saint-Roch. It passed the doorway of the apartment where Robespierre lodged. It passed shop fronts, whose owners had, only 2 decades earlier, sold ribbons and silks to the Queen's household. She did not look down. The historian Antonia Fraser draws on multiple eyewitness accounts to describe the Queen's bearing during this final ride. She was visibly weakened by months of imprisonment and by the bleeding that had never stopped. She was visibly cold in the autumn air. She was, by every account that survives, composed. The cart arrived at the Place de la Viniscante for le Ganner Saint-Fournef Nassadenelf. The cart arrived at the Place de la Viniscatators. The guillotine had been erected in the center of the open ground. Its blade was angled, weighted, and dark with months of use. Around it stood the National Guard, the assistants of the executioner, and the small group of officials who would witness the moment. She was helped down from the cart. Her hands were still bound. The historian Evelyn Lever has noted that the wooden steps leading up to the platform were narrow and steep, and that even an able-bodied prisoner found them difficult. She climbed them quickly. Some accounts say she climbed them so quickly that one of the assistants stumbled trying to follow her. Near the top of the platform, she stepped, by accident, on the foot of Charles Henry Sanson. She turned to him. The exchange that followed was recorded by Sanson's own family in the executioner's memoirs, which were later compiled and edited. She apologized to him. She said, in essence, that she had not done it on purpose. The phrasing preserved in the historical record is brief and quiet. It is a sentence of perhaps a dozen words. These were the last words attributed to Marie Antoinette. She was placed against the upright board of the device. The board was tilted forward. Her neck was secured in the lunette. The mechanism above her was released. The blade fell at 12:15 in the afternoon, October 16, 1793. What followed was the brief mechanical ritual of the revolutionary execution. Sanson lifted the head. He showed it, by custom, to the four sides of the square. Some in the crowd cheered. Others, by every surviving account, remained silent. The reactions were divided. Her body was placed in a simple wooden coffin. There was no ceremony. There was no marker. The coffin was carried, with several others from the same day's executions, to the cemetery of the Madeleine, a small burial ground a short distance from the square. The cemetery was crowded with the recent dead. Lime was poured into the trenches to accelerate decomposition. The coffin of the former queen was lowered into a section reserved for those executed by the tribunal. Some accounts state that her head was placed between her feet, in the manner reserved for traitors. Others state that the grave diggers, finishing their day's work, simply closed the trench without ceremony. She was 37 years old. She had been queen consort of France for 16 years. She had been a widow for 9 months. She had been a prisoner for 1 year, 2 months, and 6 days. The Place de la Révolution emptied within an hour. The blood was washed from the wood. The next prisoner was already being prepared in the Conciergerie. The reign of terror would consume more than 16,000 additional lives in the coming year. Many of the names on its registry would be the names of the men who, on this October afternoon, had cheered the death of the Queen. In the silence that followed her execution, for somewhere in the cemetery of the Madeleine, in a trench filled with strangers, Marie Antoinette of Austria, last Queen of France of the old regime, was already being forgotten. It would be more than 2 decades before anyone came back to look for her bones. In the years that followed, the revolution turned on itself. Jacques Hébert, who had accused her of unspeakable acts in open court, was sent to the same guillotine in March of 1794, less than 5 months after her death. Maximilien Robespierre, architect of the Reign of Terror, followed him in July of the same year. Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, the prosecutor who had intercepted her final letter, her son, the young boy whose coerced testimony had been used against her, did not survive captivity. Louis Charles the Dauphin died in the Temple Tower in June of 1795, at the age of 10, of illness and neglect. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in 1814. The new king, Louis XV, ordered the recovery of his sister-in-law's remains from the Madeleine cemetery. The bones were identified, with difficulty, by the elastic of a garter found in the trench. They were transferred to the royal necropolis at the Basilica of Saint-Denis. The letter she had written at 4:30 in the morning of her last day was finally delivered, in a sense, to history. Her sister-in-law was already dead. 3 years before the revolution reached its terror, the Anglo-Irish statesman Edmund Burke published his reflections on the revolution in France. He warned that revolutions which began in the name of liberty had a tendency to consume the people who made them. He warned that the public square, once consecrated to spectacle, would not stop demanding new bodies. He was largely dismissed at the time. The men who tried Marie Antoinette did not read him. The men who cheered her death did not read him. Within 2 years, almost all of them had been carried in the same carts, through the same streets, to the same wooden frame. The lesson is not new. The Greeks knew it. The Romans knew it. Hannah Arendt, writing in the 20th century after the totalitarian catastrophes of her own age, would frame it more simply. Revolutions devour their children. Public theater requires fresh actors. The crowd at the Place de la Révolution went home that afternoon. The blade was cleaned. The cart was sent back for the next passenger. The wood does not remember. Only the historians do. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story revealed something about the slow architecture of cruelty hidden behind the famous image of the guillotine, subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who needs to understand how revolutions truly end. You have just watched another premium documentary from Velours Spectre. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. The descent into the past continues.